In my opinion, Skyrim was a very vanilla fantasy RPG, so it's no surprise why it connected to so many people. Being vanilla doesn't mean something is bad at all. Fallout 4 was a step back from that, and Starfield was more of a lateral movement from Fallout 4. It has different flaws from Fallout 4, but just as many. People are just more forgiving towards Fallout 4 because it's superficially Fallout. We see the same overly forgiving attitude with how well the Fallout TV show was received. You have to remember a common sentiment for Fallout 4 was that it isn't really a Fallout game at all. This has to do with a general betrayal of the message that Fallout has generally had in the past. It's mainly supposed to be critical of human civilization because what keeps holding us back is the inevitability of conflict. Hence the phrase, war never changes. Fallout 1, 2, 3, and Fallout New Vegas are all about that phrase. Fallout 4 is very lighthearted, hopeful, and goofy at times. It also never really touches that message. It implies that whatever faction you choose will likely make things better in some way. We don't see the unavoidable consequences of human conflict that set back civilization. There are also clear signs of last-minute story changes that make Fallout 4's story less coherent, like Sean being a synth instead of Sean being raised by the Institute and being unable to see you as their parent, hence why Sean is calling the Institute leader father. It was his adopted father in the original context. They awkwardly rewrote it so that everyone calls him father because he's the real Sean and his DNA is used to make all the synths, which doesn't entirely make sense why everybody calls him father. Sean is actually a synth because rejecting a real child to die in a nuclear explosion is too offensive for Bethesda to even consider anymore. I'm not trying to just bash Fallout 4, but making the point again that when Bethesda went from Fallout 4 to Starfield, it was more of a lateral movement and not a step backwards. Far Harbor specifically is an outlier in all this. I wanted to talk about common complaints people have with Starfield and how that's more of a sign that they don't fully know why they hate it. It's impossible to make a good game with the creation engine. If this was your biggest complaint, then I wouldn't recommend any Bethesda game since Morrowind. Bethesda has been using more or less the same engine. We have seen other companies do something similar over the years. World of Warcraft has been using the same mess being built up over several years, and nobody complains WoW is bad because of the engine. Windows has been built up the same way, just laying bricks endlessly on the same foundation forever. A bad carpenter blames his tools. It's better to blame Bethesda for being incompetent. You are giving them an excuse for poor performance. Don't do that. Too many loading screens. If this really bothers you, then again, I can't recommend any Bethesda RPG. Starfield has some of the shortest loading screens of any game they've made to date, partially because of solid-state drives. The way Bethesda structures their games is with an overworld and interior cells that represent building interiors. You can see games even on old systems like the Super Nintendo that do this. This was a very common way to structure games. The reason why Bethesda probably does it is because they have interiors with hundreds to thousands of physics-enabled objects scattered everywhere, and you can't just have a whole city load up with all that clutter on an Xbox. This is not a problem in games like The Witcher 3. Personally, I don't mind loading screens that are 2 to 5 seconds long. It seems like a weird thing to be hung up on, especially because Fallout 4 is known to have an infinite loading screen bug. Loading screens are way worse in every other Bethesda game, including Skyrim. If anything is making them shorter, it's solid state drives and modern hardware. But nobody complained in the past, and you can fast travel to other planets in 1 or 2 loading screens in Starfield. That ends up being close to 4 to 10 seconds of waiting. So, too many bugs. It's very common for games to be buggy now. It's not a trend I like, but even comparing Starfield to Cyberpunk 2077, in Cyberpunk some builds just do not work. When I was playing Phantom Liberty, my hacker build would get so much RAM regeneration and it would overflow into the negative, constantly draining all my RAM instead. You have to reload a save to fix that. There are builds that just break in Cyberpunk. At least in Starfield, the skills don't break the game. It's fine to argue the skills are more boring in Starfield, like a plus 10% to damage, but that's a different conversation. I've almost exclusively seen graphical bugs on occasion, or a few crashes in very specific situations. I just haven't seen as many issues as most people have. I don't mod and will often do clean installs of the game before playing again if I've been away for months to years. Doing that stuff helps. Also, updating to your latest drivers helps a lot. Too much exposition or dialogue. It's an RPG. I don't know what people are expecting. It's like complaining there's too much reading in a visual novel. There's a clip of Luke Stevens playing Shattered Space on stream, and he's just mocking it.
Even see this clip from our stream earlier that I'll Jacob play for you. Kind of perfectly encapsulates the feeling of the expansion for me and a lot of people that were in chat while we played it. Check it out.
Trapped halfway between our universe and the vortex. The Citadel itself remains in such a state. Right there and yet beyond our reach.
They've been talking so long that it went to the like standby camera. Even the game got bored.
And there's nothing wrong with doing that, but also not giving the DLC a fair chance. You can't review something fairly if you close your mind to it. Imagine if I played The Witcher 3 and during the opening exposition dump, I just kept saying, boring! This is boring! Why is there all this talking? That would be rightfully identifying me as engaging with the game in bad faith. Many people can't articulate why they hate Starfield and just start blaming random things like exposition dumping in an RPG of all things. The story in Starfield is bad. Starfield attempts to make a meta-commentary story partially inspired by real-world religions like what Morrowind did. It's also focused on how people play games and put them down for months or years and then come back to them. That's where the more meta aspects come from. The Starborn are placeholders for you, the player character, in a weird way. It's more of a mirror than most people notice. It's fine if people hate it, but it's an attempt to course correct from stories like Fallout 4. The dialogue options are vastly expanded, based on skills, traits, and backgrounds you have, even more so than what Fallout New Vegas did. This was another good course correction. In Cyberpunk 2077, your background is effectively meaningless and you barely ever get skill-related dialogue checks. Starfield is actually pretty close to Fallout New Vegas in the frequency of skill-related dialogue checks. You can still hate the story Starfield is trying to tell anyway, and meta stories are very divisive by nature. If I were to sum up the basic message of Starfield, is that even if life is meaningless, you have to give it meaning. It's a common and cliche sentiment, but it's one of the main interpretations you can take away from it, though not the only one. This somehow flies over the heads of most people. They usually complain about everything being meaningless in a multiverse, an important aspect of the story, and it not making sense, simply because they don't want to pay attention to it. There is an argument to say the story is really bad, but I've never really seen anyone actually make the argument. They just offhandedly dismiss it because they don't know why they hate it and can't be bothered to figure that out. You'd think professional critics would articulate their opinions because it's kind of their whole job. Value for money in Starfield is bad. Part of the problem with Bethesda is that they have to compete with themselves. Skyrim is $40, Fallout 4 and all the DLC is $40, New Vegas Ultimate is $20, Morrowind is $15. You get the idea. I can name some DLCs for Bethesda games that were very short, like Shattered Spaces, the Automatron DLC and Nuka World DLC from Fallout 4, Honest Hearts in Fallout New Vegas, The Pit in Fallout 3, and Hearthfire in Skyrim. The main difference is that Bethesda didn't charge $30 for any of those. When Starfield gets a small add-on like Shattered Space, which in the past would have only been $10 to $15, and they charge $30 for it, then it's no surprise why so many people are mad. You can buy other Bethesda games that have way more content for as much or less money at times. Add in all the Creation Club stuff they've been doing, and of course the consumer feels nickel and dimed. I think the two biggest issues are that some people were expecting a space flight sim game added on top of Fallout 4 and they didn't get that. The second major problem is the feeling that Bethesda is trying to bleed everyone dry. Bethesda is clawing for every penny you have. Then when you get something like Fallout 4, but way more expensive, people are just mad. You can't make people happy when they feel like they're being cheated. Of course, some people just hate that it isn't Fallout or the next Elder Scrolls and just don't want to admit that. If you hate Starfield's story, it's a bigger issue that Bethesda can't correct for, because even if they have one good DLC that's worth playing, you can't, like, no game's story is so good that you would just play it for one DLC. It would help a lot if they added a Fallout 4 style survival mode and they limited jump distances from your ship in association with capital cities and settlements you had built, so it would justify the settlement building and it would add more depth to the game by requiring you to engage in all of its systems. Far Harbor is mainly so beloved because it gives players a lot of agency with how you interact with the factions and a lot of the stuff that you do, and people are kind of unhappy with a lot of the quest lines and Starfield and how you don't really have choices and you don't really see any consequences of your actions, and the factions don't really interact much. And if we could return to kind of that dynamic, interactive storytelling that was all over Far Harbor, people would probably like Starfield a lot more. And people are hoping to see something from Bethesda that returns to that high mark that DLC put. Like, people care most about player agency, and Bethesda needs to realize that. It's about that dynamic storytelling. That's why people keep replaying RPGs. And so there needs to be a return to form to that to make the most people happy. But of course, you're never going to make most people happy. So I don't know what they could do for sure to try to fix the situation.